Welcome, believers. Welcome to the wonderfully weird world of the Tinfoil Hat Fan Club, where we talk about all the batshit crazy stuff that goes on in the world, and there's loads. On today's episode, I would like to carry on the orb theme and talk about the 1940s Foo Fighters, okay? Well, obviously, now we think about today's standards, they were obviously orbs, and they were obviously following fighter pilots and stuff like that. So, stick around and I'll tell you all about it. Welcome, believers. Please like, subscribe, and ding that notification bell. Keep looking up. Okay, the orb story then, the 1940s Foo Fighters, right? Most of us have heard the term Foo Fighter, and those in UFO circles know they are largely strange orbs witnessed by fighter pilots in the Second World War. Okay, however, while these orb-like sightings are perhaps the most well-known of such incidents during the early to mid 1940s, they are not the most intriguing or indeed the most detailed. Coincidentally or not, they're also not the most well known, apparently, right? Now, the mothership incident of 1942, we'll discuss that one, right, are perhaps a good example of such encounters. Such was the seriousness of the report that the British Ministry of Defence would conduct their own investigation, right? According to their reports, the crew of a Lancaster bomber would see a huge object flying above them, right? They would estimate the size to be anywhere from 200 to 300 feet. 8 lights, each set in pairs, shone underneath the mammoth object. Given its apparent altitude, it appeared to be moving at around 500 miles per hour. Okay. Furthermore, the captain of the Lancaster would report seeing the same object several months earlier. Maybe it was following him, right? The encounter happened again while on a bombing mission of a German occupied territory. On this occasion, it would fly underneath their position for several minutes before disappearing. Right, despite the official reports, the sightings are still a mystery. All right, so they never did suss what it was. Now, while conducting blind flying exercises with a student pilot on the 5th of April 1943, where the student literally places his head under a hood and relies solely on navigational equipment. Okay, that's what this bloke was doing, learning how to fly. Pilot Jerry Casey would notice a bright flash of light coming from the San Diego mountains, right, that overlook Long Beach, California. As their plane continued over the blue Pacific Ocean below them, the flash suddenly became an object speeding towards them. Now, Casey would order his student to come out from under the hood. As he did, he witnessed a strange wobble, right, affect the craft before it suddenly appeared at their side, right? So they've looked, and before the craft appeared, it wobbled slightly. The move occurred in what seemed to be no longer than a second. Casey would later describe the craft to be unlike any airplane I've ever seen. Right now, still in awe, Casey would reach for his camera. Now, I'll get this, right? Just as he was about to snap the picture, he stopped himself. Suddenly, he entertained the notion that the craft might be a secret military vehicle. Believing he would land himself in trouble by taking an unauthorised picture of a vehicle, he put his camera away. Now, the craft maintained its position alongside their plane for another 30 seconds before making another strange curved turn. And in a flash, the craft was disappearing over the ocean. Now, upon landing, Casey and his student discussed the incident privately. They would both agree that the estimated speed of the craft was somewhere close to 7,000 miles an hour. It had no propeller or any other visible means of propulsion. So, both also agreed the craft appeared to wobble or perform a curving move. Now, this is an interesting observation because some UFO researchers state that UFO propulsion involves the bending of space or even the atmosphere of planets. This gives the effect To those who see them, they appear to reappear and appear instantly. It is bend from one location to another. Now we're talking Star Trek, aren't we? Right, warp speed, right? This is something we'll look at for future articles, I reckon. I reckon what we should do is, when we get the chance, look into this, right? So they're saying that you could bend. So if that's time, you bend it like that, and you know what I'm saying? Star Trek stuff, right? So now, Casey largely remained silent about the incident for some time. This was mainly due to his belief that he had witnessed a secret military test plane. Maybe he did. However, as other UFO reports poured into the public arena following the war, Casey would eventually tell of his account. Now, due to the fact that there is no known military aircraft, even today, capable of what he saw, he would also openly entertain the idea of a possible extraterrestrial involvement. All right, 7,000 miles per hour, that's quite fast, isn't it? So then, Foo Fighters, right? Foo Fighters during the D-Day invasion. Now, one of the most intriguing cases of Foo Fighters, and bearing in mind these are orbs, so one of the most intriguing cases of Foo Fighters sightings took place on the 6th of June during the D-Day invasion over Normandy. An account of which can be found in the book of Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials by Michael Joseph, and I'll stick it up there, right? Okay. The sighting came from an American serviceman on board a B-17 bomber. The plane's target was a railroad depot and took place slightly before the landings began, right? The witness was a gunner on the right side of the plane. Now, it was around 1 a.m. when the plane crossed over the channel when another crew member suddenly announced he had seen bandits at 6 o'clock. So it's tense. I mean, you can't put yourself in that situation, can you, when you're flying a bomber in wartime? So this would prompt the gunner to prepare to fire. However, even though he couldn't see anything obvious, the gun appeared to jam, right? So, the gun jammed. It was as he was examining the mysteriously crippled gun that he witnessed the bandits, right, his crewmate had announced. However, they appeared to be completely different from any aircraft he'd ever seen before. They were seemingly glowing and sphere-like with no markings or insignia. Now, as I said before, right, and I'll keep going on about it, these orbs have been knocking around for ages. That is obviously an orb. They called them Foo Fighters, but they were orbs, right? I don't think they were Tic Tacs, but I think they were orbs, right? As one of these strange objects moved into a position to the side of the plane, the electrical system and radio suddenly went dead on the bomber. Now, because of this, the plane began to fall out of line with the rest of the formation of bombers. And this was particularly dangerous as it meant they were an easy target for enemy fighters and for the strange spherical objects, right? Now, as the plane fell back through, the strange object vanished at great speed, right? Several minutes later, the radio and electrics came back to life, as did the plane's engines, right? Now, even stranger, right? The witness's gun suddenly unjammed. So what we are saying basically is that Foo Fighter totally turned off that plane, right? Could it be an EMP type of thingy? We don't know, do we, right? So the same book also speaks of another incident. Remember that book I mentioned? There it is, right? The same book also speaks of another incident involving a B-17 bomber almost a year earlier in September 1943. The plane was on a bombing mission over Stuttgart. On their way there, with several enemy planes in front of them at an altitude of around 3,000 feet, they suddenly noticed a cluster composed of small round objects that were silver in colour. What's more, these objects appeared to just fall out of the sky, and they were there, right? The crew on board the plane also witnessed the sight, as did the crew of another B-17. They quickly established the strange spheres were not German, as enemy planes continued onwards, seemingly ignorant of these glowing objects. They would ultimately rest and hover at the same altitude as the B-17 planes, right? And of course, obviously, if you do follow the Foo Fighter stories, they did tend to follow planes, didn't they? However, Some of the objects made contact with one of the plane's wings. Upon doing so, it immediately went out in flames and began to fall out of the sky. The plane was never recovered, and the crew, sadly, was presumed dead. Now, this is a particularly strange case in that most Foo Fighters sightings remain exactly that, just sightings. This would appear to be the only example of a Foo Fighter causing the destruction of a plane, as well as the deaths of the 10 crew on board. So I would have liked to think that that was possibly an accident. It didn't happen before and it didn't happen after. Now, another story, right, about an oil refinery incident, right? In early August 1944, while piloting a B-29 Super Fortress aircraft on a return flight from a bombing mission over the Plajo oil refinery in Sumatra, First Officer Russell Watson would report seeing a bizarre and confusing type of new weapon. What's more, other pilots and crew members on the same bombing mission also witnessed the same glowing objects. The sightings occurred only 10 minutes into the return flight. Now, he would continue in his report on how one of the planes seemingly came under attack for about an hour and 10 minutes. Watson would elaborate that several reddish orange balls, seemingly no larger than baseballs, appeared out of nowhere. As they moved, they will momentarily flash, which was followed by a strange explosion. Even stranger, these balls would break into several fragments, which then went in different directions before coming back together. And we have seen that lately, haven't we? You know, I don't know if you watch YouTube, or I'm sure you do, or TikTok, where you see like what looks like a mothership and it's spitting out little balls of fire. I mean, maybe it's the same sort of thing, you know. So, another Foo Fighter incident unfolded in early November 1944 and was witnessed by an American pilot, Harry Cow, right, while stationed in France. While they were navigating over the Rhine Valley in a P-61 Black Widow night fighter, they noticed strange lights that had suddenly appeared as if out of nowhere, and they were flying alongside their plane. Now, unsure of what the object was, the crew at first attempting evasive moves to shake the lights off. However, they would maintain their position alongside the plane. They just couldn't shake them, right? Thinking they were about to be under attack, the crew made the decision to open fire. They appeared to find their target, and suddenly a huge explosion rocked the plane, even bending the plexiglass dome on top. Now, whether this is one of the only cases of a plane managing to destroy a thing or not, I don't know. Or whether the strange light simply disappeared is perhaps open to debate, right? So did the plane actually destroy the Foo Fighter? Thinking they were about to be attacked, the crew made the decision to open fire. They appeared to find their target, and suddenly a huge explosion rocked the plane, even bending the plate, that's how they say, right? So it does sound to me like they managed to blow it up, right? Cow would also report that many pilots who he served with over the Rhine Valley also saw strange lights. However, partly because their superior had already issued orders to maintain the secrecy of such sightings, many would choose not to report the incident, and we understand that, don't we, right? Choosing instead only to speak about them with other pilots who have witnessed similar things. They are very likely dozens, if not hundreds, of unreported sightings of Foo Fighters during the Second World War by British and American pilots. What's more, there were many sightings of the same objects by the Soviet troops. And this is where we will turn our attention next, okay? So, we talked about the British and we talked about the American. Let's drop a Soviet one in, right? So, abandoned Soviet bomber mission, right? The previous year, on the other side of the Atlantic in 1944, Soviet pilots Boris Surikov and his commander, Major Benjanov, had their own experience with a large and unrecognisable craft in the air. Perhaps making the incident even more pressurised was the fact that the Soviet pilots were carrying a full bomb load. Of course, to bomb oil refineries used by the Germans in Romania, the strange object joined them over South Ukraine. The effect on the plane was instant. Do you think these UFOs were trying to interfere? It's hard to say, it? Because, do you think apparently they do have walls? If you go back to her early painting, it does depict, full blown aerial situations going on. So, but look, the oil pressure began to shoot instantly upwards, while the exterior began to shake violently. Whenever the pilots would get too close to the cockpit window, they would feel an electrical surge. All the while, the undetonated and fully loaded bombs sat ready to fulfill their purpose. These effects would continue even after the craft had vanished from sight. Right, eventually, the pilots decided to jettison their bombs right away. Then they slowly, allowing for time, made their way back to the base. They would keep the incident to themselves, instead telling their superiors that they had dropped the payload on their target. To admit abandoning their mission would likely have led to the two pilots being in military charges. So, there are several other sightings that come from Soviet troops of strange silvery objects over Europe, many of which came to us from Soviet-born UFO researcher Paul Stonehill. Now, one occurred just before the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. In the immediate moment before the battle was about to begin, Soviet troops noticed a huge silvery disc hovering directly over the enemy position. Now, at first, Soviet officers believed the object was a new secret weapon of the Nazis. However, after several moments, it simply vanished. Much like the vast majority of Foo Fighter sightings, there was no direct action from the vehicle. It merely appeared to watch proceedings. Due to no one managing or capturing a photograph of the object, a drawing was made immediately and then given to several Soviet officers who signed it off as corroboration of what they had seen. So, Foo Fighters. Another sighting occurred a little short of 2 months later, only days after fighting stopped in Kursk. A high-ranking Soviet officer, now his name was Gennady Zelikinov, would report seeing a sickle-shaped craft that moved with a speed considerably faster than any plane he had witnessed before. A sickle-shaped one. What is perhaps interesting here is that many flying wing UFOs were reported across the United States in the late 1940s and early 50s, some of which could well be described as sickle-shaped. An even further intriguing detail, and something that comes up in many sightings in the contemporary era, is that the exterior of the craft was dark blue or black, and the underside had a bright orange light in the centre. Another intriguing sighting occurred a little over a year later in November 1944 in the skies over Poland. And it's where we will turn our attention next, right? So the sighting over Poland. During a bombing mission while flying over Poland, navigator Lee Petrovich, along with the pilot and the rear gunner, witnessed a glowing object moving at a relatively slow pace over a Soviet-controlled airfield near Warsaw. They would estimate the object was flying at an altitude of around 1,600 feet. The sighting was also corroborated by a Soviet officer on the ground, Lieutenant Colonel Kovalchuk. Now, at the airfield itself, he would estimate that it was around 500 feet in length and appeared to move without making a sound. Now, furthermore, there were no markings anywhere on its exterior, as one might expect to see in an aircraft at that time, because otherwise you're going to get shot down. Not that there was any other source of propulsion either, so there was no markings, there was no propulsion, no propellers. I don't think we had jet fighters in them days, but there was no obvious signs of propulsion. Now, the incident became even stranger when the air defence units opened fire on the object, thinking it was a secret German aircraft. However, despite the barrage hitting their target, they seemingly had no effect whatsoever. The object simply continued on its path and eventually disappeared to the north of the base. What does remind you a little bit of like the Washington flap. When all those spotlights converged on that aircraft and they were bombarding it for hours and it just simply didn't make any difference. Now that was it the 1942 Washington flap? Okay, so check that out. I have done a video on it, but that was barraged and it didn't get touched. So, now it's interesting to note that the Soviets, like the American and British forces, believed the strange objects to be secret aerial crafts of the Nazi regime. Of course, after the war, when conversations would take place between Allied troops and the German forces, it would become clear that the German troops likewise believed the strange crafts were of the Allied technology. So, of course, they're not communicating, are they? Germany thinks it's ours, and we thinks it's Germany, right? Russia thinks it's Germany, Germany thinks it's Russia, and so on and so forth. Now, if the objects were terrestrial in nature, we would imagine that files would have to come to light by now. And what's more, if they were the result of one side or the other, why would these strange crafts seemingly harass their own planes and risk their own soldiers? It wasn't ours. If we dismiss the notion of battle fatigue and hallucinations for a moment, the only logical answer is that these strange crafts are UFOs. They're intelligence unknown. So while it's clear that the vast majority of Foo Fighting sightings occurred over Europe, where much of the bloodiest fighting took place, both in the air and on the ground, there are other sightings on record from much farther afield, right? So, for example, in February 1943, Kent Courtney was taking a transport plane from Brazil to Morocco. He was flying at an altitude of 10,000 feet over the South Atlantic Ocean when he suddenly noticed there were several bright lights heading straight for him. They would turn away from him and fly past his plane at the last minute. However, within seconds, they had turned around and were heading for his plane once more, this time from behind. They would stop momentarily alongside him and then would disappear into the night sky as quickly as they came. Now, once Courtney landed in Casablanca, he would report the sightings to the United States Air Force. He would recall that his orders or official advice was to keep it to himself. He would later state in an interview with Louisiana newspaper that the Air Force wished to quell the investigation. Courtney, however, knowing he had seen something truly out of the ordinary, would begin speaking to numerous US Air Force pilots, many of whom would declare their own encounter, right? So, even earlier in September 1941, right, a Polish merchant vessel transporting British troops, the SS Pulaski, was sailing through the Indian Ocean. On one particular evening, two of the sailors who were stood on the deck witnessed a strange globe glowing with greenish light. They would later estimate that the object was around half the size of a full moon as it appeared to us on Earth, right? They would quickly bring the light to the attention of one of the British officers who also saw the strange object before it disappeared. Right, so look, these Foo Fighters, they're everywhere, aren't they? Right, perhaps one of the most interesting of the Foo Fighter silence to have occurred outside of Europe took place on the evening of the 3rd of November 1944. Several Mitchell B-25 bombers left their airbase in Burma on a bombing mission over Japanese-occupied China. It was while they were in the middle of an attack on key bridges that several glittering objects suddenly appeared to begin circling the bombers, right? Glittering objects. And like other Foo Fighting sightings, these strange glowing spheres seemed to appear out of nowhere. Also, much like other Foo Fighting sightings, the bombers would experience electrical and engine failure as soon as the objects appeared. It's got to be an electrical thing, isn't it? The gunners on board the planes would attempt to lock on the strange targets. However, they move much too fast and erratically for them to open fire on. The object would disappear just as quickly as they appeared, because that's another thing. And like any other sighting, as they did so, the bombers' electrical equipment returned to good working order. Right, so look, these are Foo Fighters, and I'm sure there are hundreds of stories out there, hundreds. But they are certainly orbs from the 1940s, aren't they? Okay, so as again, I know we've got massive orb sightings now, and it's very, very strange. But they've been knocking about for a very, very, very long time. All right, we've got to ask ourselves is why are they appearing now in great number? At first I thought it was maybe because people are looking for them. And I do genuinely think that's part of it, right? Most of the time, you walk down the road blissfully unaware of what's going on because now we've got TikTok, we've got YouTube, we've got Instagram, we've got Facebook. Everyone is sticking sightings on there. So this major uptake it could be a busier situation. It could be our own little wave of 2025, where for some reason these things appear in mass. But it's obviously proof that they have been knocking around for a very long time. Okay, well, this was the Tinfoil Hat Fan Club. I really appreciate you watching, sticking around. Please like and subscribe if you can. Obviously, drop me a question. Quite happy to answer. Like, subscribe, and ding the notification bell. And I will catch you on the next one. Stay safe.